We go back to the early 1800s. A missionary sent out with his wife, Adoniram and Judson, from the northeast, sailing all the way over to India. They finally land in Burma to be missionaries, Baptist missionaries, often touted as the first American foreign missionaries sent to Burma, and so they were. And they went to Burma, they went to the Southeast Asian part of the world in a time where you didn't really survive very long. In fact, the statistics have been analyzed. And if you went to that part of the world, Southeast Asia, your life expectancy once you arrived was 5 years. The average life expectancy for Western missionaries arriving in Southeast Asia was 5 years. Now here's the catch, right? Here's the clincher. It takes 4 years to acquire the language enough to be able to preach. So these guys that were signing up for missions work in the early 1800s were ostensibly signing up for 1 year's work. 4 years of grueling language training while their body is breaking down from certain diseases and different things in climate and issues that they'd never suffered from before. In their last year, they would get a chance to preach, and then they'd go to their reward. Now that was normal. That was par for the course. But this one missionary, Adoniram Judson, outlasted all of them. In fact, he was in Burma for decades. He was often appreciated as something of an anomaly. How's his body so robust? He often got sick. He buried 2 wives, 6 children, because of how harsh the environment was compared to what their bodies were used to. And after several decades, his health had so broken down that the doctors encouraged him, "You're going to die," which Judson was perfectly content with. "All right, I'm going to die. That's fine. I've had a great run. I've been preaching for decades where most other missionaries that sailed out to do work in this region did not survive. Let me die." But the doctors and the mission sending agency were not willing to allow Judson to just die in a ditch in Burma. And so he was encouraged to go on a sailing trip back to the US. He goes back to the US. He hadn't been there in literally decades. And there he was, trying his best to recover and to not work. Now you can imagine when he arrives in the US, you can imagine he's like celebrity. Every church, every conference, every denomination, every publishing house wanted to secure Judson for a speaking event, for a promotion event. And Judson said no to all of it. In fact, he could barely talk at all. Such was his ill health. His body was so broken, he could barely speak louder than a whisper. Now, curiously, on that time back in the US, he agreed to do one event in an old church in his old hometown. Now, he was announced as the guest preacher at this small little country town church, maybe sat about 800 people, and that entire part of the country swarmed to the church. In fact, it was reputed that on the day that Judson would speak, trains were backed up and blocked. That the church building nearly crumbled under the weight of people packing in to get just a glimpse of this missionary. They came from all around. They queued up for hours outside the church building, desperately seeking to get a seat before such a man who had no doubt many thrilling stories to tell. And Judson did. If you've never read a biography of Adoniram Judson, I encourage you to read it. Some of the most astounding missionary stories come from that man's life. His health is broken, his voice rendered a mere whisper. Judson nevertheless took the platform and spoke passionately for 15 minutes. This was America's longest living pioneer missionary, standing before a sea of admiring brothers and sisters in Christ. This man escaped death from both wild cats and emperors alike. He had no shortage of stories to tell. Nevertheless, on this occasion, Judson did nothing more and nothing less than tell the one story that moved him the most. For 15 minutes, in this kind of this holy hush of a whisper that he could express, he just told the story of Christ and him crucified. That God sent his son, his only begotten son, born of the virgin woman, born under the law, to succeed in keeping the law where every sinner failed, and yet to go to the cross and to be punished on behalf of those who would receive him by faith. To his dismay, The people's reaction was not quite what Judson expected. The people are very much disappointed, a friend said to him on their journey home. They wonder why you didn't talk about something else. Why? Judson said. What did they want? I presented to the best of my ability the most interesting subject in the world. But they wanted something different, this friend implored. They wanted a story. Well, Judson says, I'm sure I gave them quite the story. The most thrilling story that could ever be conceived of. Of course, Judson is referencing the story of Christ and him crucified. His friend continued to implore, but they'd heard that before. They wanted something new from a man who just returned from the Antipodes, from the wild jungles of Burma. Judson became agitated. He said that I'm glad that they now can say that a man coming from the Antipodes has nothing better to tell them than the wondrous story of the dying love of Jesus. He didn't stop there. My business, he said, is to preach the gospel of Christ. And when I can speak at all, I dare not trifle with my commission. When I looked upon these people today, I remember that I shall meet them next, standing before the judgment seat of Christ. And I cannot furnish food for vain curiosity or tickle the fancy with amusing stories, however decently strung together a thread of religion. This is not, Judson finished by saying, this is not what Christ meant by preaching the gospel. Then how can I hereafter meet the fearful charge from the Lord? I gave you one opportunity to tell them of me. You spent it describing your own adventures. This was the burden of Judson. This meeting house filled to the brim with thousands of people. And maybe even in that place, people that had never heard the gospel. Or maybe had heard the gospel, but had just had been successful in resisting it, repelling it, rejecting it. And Judson said, I could have got up there and wowed the crowd with any number of powerful stories. But the greatest story of all, and the only story pregnant with God's power to literally change lives, is the message of Christ and Him crucified.